He bought an old barn for almost nothing. Inside stood a forgotten car, buried under dust and hay. Everyone laughed until he opened the hood. What he discovered there shocked him and changed everything. Watch till the end and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. He had learned long ago how to live with little, not because he wanted to, and not because he believed poverty made a man noble, but because life had taught him that things rarely worked out the way they were supposed to. He was a middle-aged black man who lived on the edge of a rural county where the land rolled gently and the roads narrowed into gravel paths that the maps barely bothered to name. He earned his living with his hands, taking whatever work came his way. Sometimes it was fixing fences, sometimes repairing old machinery that others had already given up on, sometimes helping neighbors with harvests or hauling scrap. It was not glamorous work, and it did not make him rich, but it kept him moving forward. He lived alone in a modest house that had seen better years, a place where the walls creaked in winter and the wind found its way through cracks no amount of caulking seemed able to close completely. Still, it was his. Every board, every loose hinge, every uneven floorboard told a story of something he had fixed himself, sometimes more than once. He trusted his hands more than promises and effort more than luck. When he heard about the barn, he was not looking for anything in particular. The offer came in passing, mentioned by a man who owned a stretch of land on the outskirts of the county. The barn had stood there for decades, long after it had stopped being useful. Its roof sagged, its walls leaned, and its doors barely closed anymore. The owner wanted it gone. He was planning to clear the land and did not want the liability of a structure that might collapse on someone one day. If nobody took it, it would be torn down and hauled away. The price was $10. At first, the number sounded like a joke. $10 was not enough to buy lunch at most places, let alone a building, but the conditions were clear. Whoever bought it took responsibility for everything inside, including the cleanup. No guarantees, no refunds, no complaints later. The barn was sold as it stood. People laughed when they heard about it. $10 or not, everyone knew the barn was a pile of rot waiting to fall apart. Some said it was dangerous to even step inside. Others joked that it would cost more to clear out the debris than the barn was worth. A few shook their heads and said the man selling it was lucky to find anyone foolish enough to take it off his hands. He listened to all of it without saying much. He had been on the receiving end of that kind of laughter before. It did not sting the way it once had. Experience had taught him that people laughed most easily at things they did not understand or did not have the patience to deal with. $10 was not much to lose. The real cost would be time and effort, and those were things he was used to spending. He went to see the barn on a gray afternoon when the air carried the quiet weight of late autumn. The ground was already hardening, and the smell of cold earth hung low. From a distance, the barn looked worse than he expected. Its wooden boards were darkened by age and weather, and the roofline dipped unevenly, as if the structure were tired of holding itself upright. One corner leaned inward, and the doors were crooked, one hanging lower than the other. Up close, the details told a deeper story. Rusted hinges groaned when he pushed the door open. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through gaps in the boards and holes in the roof. Dust floated in the air, thick enough to catch the light in slow, drifting patterns. The smell hit him immediately. Old hay, dry wood, oil, and the faint, stale scent of something that had not been disturbed in a very long time. The floor was uneven, covered in layers of dirt, straw, and debris. He stepped carefully, testing each board before putting his full weight down. Nails stuck out at odd angles, and broken tools lay scattered, as if someone had simply walked away decades ago and never returned. There were crates stacked against one wall, their markings faded beyond recognition. A broken ladder leaned uselessly in a corner, its rungs warped and cracked. As he moved deeper inside, his boot struck something solid beneath the straw. He paused, then bent down and brushed away a layer of dust and hay with his hand. What emerged was not wood or stone, but metal. He cleared more, slowly, carefully, and the shape beneath his hands began to make sense. A curved surface, a fender. He stood there for a long moment, his breath steady, his heart slowing as his mind caught up with what his eyes were telling him. He pushed aside more debris, revealing a wheel half buried in dirt and straw. It was old, far older than anything he had worked on before. Wooden spokes, worn smooth by time, peered back at him like something from another world. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became. There was a car inside the barn, hidden away and forgotten. Its body was coated in a thick layer of dust and rust, the paint long since faded into something dull and unrecognizable. The seats were torn, the leather cracked and brittle. Hay was packed into every crevice, and cobwebs stretched across the frame. It was not just old. It was ancient by modern standards, a relic from the early days of automobiles, when machines were simpler and heavier, built with an honesty that showed in every bolt and joint. He circled it slowly, taking it in from every angle. The steering wheel was intact, though cracked. The dashboard was bare, stripped of anything decorative long ago. The hood was closed, but one latch hung loose, corroded by years of neglect. He knew enough to recognize that most people would see nothing but scrap. Metal to be sold by the pound. A curiosity at best, a burden at worst. He had seen that look on people's faces before, the one that said something was not worth the trouble. Still, something about the car held him there. It was not beauty exactly, and not nostalgia either. It was the sense that this machine had once been important, had once served a purpose beyond simply being an object. It had been built to move people when movement was not easy, to carry them across distances that once seemed impossible. He lifted the hood with effort. The hinges protested, but they held. Inside, the engine was a dense cluster of metal, thick with grime and corrosion. It looked intimidating, but also strangely straightforward. No tangled wires, no complex systems layered on top of one another, just metal, gears, and space. He reached in and placed his hand on one of the components. The metal was cold, biting through his glove. Carefully, he tried to turn part of the assembly by hand. It resisted at first, then shifted slightly. Not much, but enough to make him stop and try again. It moved. The realization settled slowly. The engine was not seized. It was stiff, neglected, probably damaged in ways he could not yet see. But it was not dead. That alone was enough to change the equation. Outside the barn, a couple of people had gathered, drawn by curiosity. They watched him through the open door, exchanging glances. Someone laughed and made a remark about him finding buried treasure. Another said something about opening a museum. Their voices carried easily in the cold air. He did not respond. He closed the hood gently and stood there, looking at the car as if weighing a decision that went far beyond metal and rust. $10 was nothing. Time was something else entirely. He imagined the work ahead, clearing the barn safely, cleaning the car, figuring out what parts were missing, searching for replacements that might not exist anymore. He imagined the frustration, the setbacks, the long hours spent cold and tired with nothing to show for it. He also imagined walking away, leaving the car to be crushed along with the rest of the barn, its history erased without a second thought. That thought sat heavier with him than he expected. When he finally stepped back outside, the owner of the land raised an eyebrow, half amused. The question did not need to be spoken. Everyone already assumed the answer. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a worn bill, and placed it in the man's hand. $10 changed owners. As he walked back toward his truck, the laughter followed him, light and careless. He let it. He had learned that laughter often came before silence, and silence before understanding. He glanced back once more at the barn, at the dark doorway and the shape hidden within. He did not yet know why, but he felt certain of one thing. Before the barn came down, he needed to know what that car still had left to give. The barn did not change overnight, but his relationship with it did. After the purchase, it stopped being a curiosity and became a responsibility. Each morning he arrived with a clearer purpose, dressed in layers against the cold, carrying tools that had served him for years. The laughter had faded into the background noise of the county, replaced by the steady creak of wood and the dull thud of debris hitting the ground as he began clearing space around the car. The first task was simple in theory and exhausting in practice. He hauled out broken crates, rotten planks, rusted chains, and tools so old their original purpose could only be guessed. Dust coated his skin and clothes, settling into every fold. He worked slowly, careful not to put too much pressure on the wrong beam or board. The barn groaned at times, reminding him that patience was not optional. By the end of the first week, he had carved out a narrow pocket of order in the middle of chaos, enough space to move around the car without tripping over the past. Once the clutter was gone, the machine itself demanded attention. He brushed off layers of dirt and straw until the metal underneath became visible. Every stroke revealed another scar left by time: pitted steel, flaking paint, bolts frozen in place by rust. The car did not protest his touch, but it did not yield easily either. It felt like something that had been asleep for decades and did not appreciate being woken. He set up a makeshift work area beside it. A table built from 2 crates and a plank held his tools. A single hanging lamp cast a yellow circle of light that barely reached the edges of the space. The rest of the barn remained in shadow, watching. He began with observation. He had learned long ago that rushing into repairs was the fastest way to make things worse. He examined the car inch by inch, noting what was missing, what was broken, and what might still be salvageable. Tires were useless, cracked beyond hope. The body panels were mostly intact, though thin in places. The interior was beyond saving, but that mattered little for now. The engine was where his attention returned again and again. He drained what remained of the oil, thick and black like tar, and let it drip into a pan for hours. He removed the spark plugs carefully, afraid they might snap if forced. They came out with effort, coated in residue that told stories of long-forgotten use. He cleaned them as best he could and set them aside. Fuel was another problem entirely. The tank smelled wrong, sour and stale. When he removed the line, what came out barely deserved to be called liquid. It was more like sludge clinging stubbornly to the metal. He flushed the system repeatedly, using what little solvent he could spare, watching rust flakes wash free and settle at the bottom of the pan. It was not perfect, but it was a start. The carburetor intimidated him. He had worked on newer versions, but this was a different animal altogether. It was heavy, dense, and unforgiving. He removed it slowly, laying out each piece in the order it came apart, knowing that one mistake could cost him days. Inside, the channels were clogged with debris hardened by time. He cleaned them patiently, soaking and brushing until his fingers ached. Word spread quickly that he was serious. Neighbors stopped by, some out of curiosity, others out of boredom. A few offered advice, most of it delivered with a grin that made it clear they did not expect success. One man leaned against the doorframe and joked that he should put up a sign and charge admission. Another suggested he could sell tickets for when the thing inevitably collapsed. He nodded politely and continued working. He had learned to separate useful information from noise. Every so often, someone older would say something quietly, almost reluctantly, offering a detail from memory or experience. Those comments he stored away, knowing they were worth more than the louder jokes. After days of cleaning and reassembly, he reached the point where there was nothing left to do but try. He filled the system with fresh fluids, double-checked connections, and set the timing as best he could without proper markings. His hands shook slightly as he climbed into the seat, the old leather cracking beneath his weight. The first attempt produced nothing. The engine turned, heavy and slow, but refused to catch. He adjusted, tried again. This time there was a cough, a sound so brief he wondered if he had imagined it. On the third try, the engine sputtered to life for a few seconds before dying in a cloud of smoke. The sound echoed in the barn, loud and startling. For a moment he just sat there, heart pounding, listening to the metal tick as it cooled. He climbed out and checked everything again, making small adjustments, tightening a fitting here, loosening another there. The next attempt was better. The engine caught more firmly, running long enough for him to feel a surge of hope rise in his chest. Then it faltered, shook violently, and died again. The smell of fuel hung in the air, sharp and discouraging. By the time he shut everything down, people had gathered again. They had heard the noise and come running, expecting a spectacle. When the engine stopped, the disappointment on their faces turned quickly into laughter. Someone clapped slowly. Someone else shook his head and said it was exactly what everyone expected. He stood there, hands blackened with grease, chest tight with frustration. For the first time since buying the barn, doubt crept in. The work had taken more out of him than he wanted to admit. His back ached, his fingers were raw, and the cold seemed deeper than before. He wondered if this was the point where sensible people walked away. That night, alone in his house, the silence felt heavier. He replayed the sounds in his head, the way the engine had come alive, however briefly. He knew that sound. It was not the sound of something beyond saving. It was the sound of something close, but not quite right. The next morning, he returned to the barn with renewed focus. He went back over everything, step by step, refusing to let frustration dictate his actions. He noticed small details he had overlooked before. Tiny leaks, uneven responses, signs that pointed toward a deeper problem rather than a dead end. By evening, he had not made visible progress, but something inside him had shifted. The laughter from the day before no longer mattered. The first failure had not ended the attempt. It had defined the challenge. As he locked up the barn and walked away, the wind carried the first real bite of winter. He pulled his jacket tighter and glanced back at the dark shape inside. The engine had spoken once. He intended to make it speak again. Winter arrived not as an announcement, but as a slow tightening of the world around him. The air grew sharper each morning, biting through gloves and jackets with increasing insistence. Frost clung to the barn's warped boards, turning the wood brittle and unforgiving. Inside, the cold settled deep into the metal of the car, making every touch an act of endurance. He learned quickly that working in the barn now meant fighting not only time and decay, but the season itself. His routine changed. He rose earlier to catch the brief warmth of midday light, knowing that once the sun dipped, the barn would become a box of ice. His breath fogged the air as he worked, hanging in front of his face like a reminder of how little margin for comfort remained. Tools stuck to his gloves if he wasn't careful. Bolts burned his fingers through the fabric when he forgot himself and touched bare metal. There were mornings when he stood in the doorway and wondered if this was the point where common sense should prevail. The car sat silent and unmoving, its problems laid bare but unresolved. He could still sell it for scrap. He could tear the barn down and walk away with nothing lost but pride. Those thoughts came often now, especially when his hands shook from cold and fatigue. But each time he stepped inside, something anchored him. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps it was the quiet conviction that the engine's brief awakening had not been a fluke. He had heard it breathe. He knew what that meant. Finding parts became its own kind of trial. Modern stores had nothing that fit, and the clerks barely knew what he was talking about when he described what he needed. He drove long distances to scrap yards and back roads where old machinery lay abandoned behind fences. He asked questions of men who had not touched engines in decades. Some laughed, some waved him off, but a few paused, eyes narrowing as memory stirred. One old farmer led him to a shed half collapsed under the weight of snow. Inside were boxes of rusted odds and ends, relics that had survived only because no one had bothered to throw them away. Together they dug through the mess until they found pieces that looked close enough to matter. Nothing fit perfectly. Everything required adjustment, compromise, and patience. Back in the barn, he focused on the heart of the problem. The carburetor became his obsession. He disassembled it again, more carefully this time, laying each component out on clean cloth. He studied the channels, the way fuel should move, the places where air could betray him. With numb fingers, he cleaned and recleaned until the metal showed through. He replaced what he could, improvised where he had to, always mindful that one careless move could destroy something irreplaceable. The fuel system fought him at every step. Rust flakes reappeared no matter how many times he flushed the lines. He added temporary filters, cleaned them, then cleaned them again. Each improvement felt fragile, like a promise that might be broken without warning. The cold thickened the fuel, slowing its movement, forcing him to rethink solutions he thought he understood. Electrical work brought its own frustrations. The wiring was brittle, insulation cracking when bent. He replaced sections piece by piece, checking connections with the patience of someone who had learned the cost of haste. He tested the spark repeatedly, adjusting gaps by feel when measurements were unreliable. Every small success came at the price of frozen hands and aching joints. There were days when progress seemed to reverse itself. A hose would split unexpectedly. A fitting would leak despite his best efforts. Once a small component snapped in his hand, and he stood there staring at it, anger rising hot against the cold. He nearly threw it across the barn. Instead, he set it down and walked outside until the sting in his eyes faded. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. The engine responded differently to his efforts. It turned more freely, When it caught, it stayed alive longer, its rhythm uneven but recognizable. He listened closely, learning its moods, its warnings, its needs. The car was teaching him, and he was listening. The people who came to watch noticed the change as well, though few admitted it. The laughter softened, turning into curiosity tinged with disbelief. Someone asked how it was going and did not smile when he answered. Another offered a tool without making a joke of it. These were small shifts, but he felt them. As winter deepened, the barn became both refuge and prison. He spent hours there, wrapped in layers, moving slowly to conserve warmth. He learned to warm parts with his hands before installing them, to plan each task so that nothing was wasted. Fatigue settled into his bones, but with it came a growing sense of control. The machine was no longer an enemy. It was a challenge he understood. One evening, after a long day of adjustments, he tried again. The engine started and ran, rough but steady enough that he dared not touch anything. He stood there listening, afraid that the slightest movement might break the spell. When it finally died, it did so gently, as if acknowledging the progress made. He leaned against the car, breathing hard, his clothes stiff with cold. The barn was silent except for the ticking of cooling metal. For the first time since winter had begun, he allowed himself a small smile. The work was far from done, but the direction was clear. Outside, snow fell steadily, blanketing the land and muffling sound. Inside the barn, amid the cold and decay, something old was slowly coming back to life. He shut off the lamp and closed the door behind him, knowing that tomorrow would bring more hardship. It would also bring another chance to move forward. The snow had settled into the land as if it meant to stay forever. By the time the worst of the cold stabilized into a dull, constant presence, the barn had become a place of routine rather than resistance. What once felt hostile now felt familiar. The man no longer hesitated at the doorway. He knew exactly where to step, where the boards creaked, where the light fell when he switched on the lamp. The car stood where it always had, but it no longer felt abandoned. It felt like something waiting. The engine was the first to demand his full attention again. After weeks of cleaning, adjusting, and trial, it had reached a point where small changes made noticeable differences. He learned to listen to it the way one listens to another person, not just to the noise, but to what lay underneath. A slight hesitation here meant fuel. A sharper knock there meant timing. He stopped thinking in terms of fixing and started thinking in terms of balance. He adjusted the mixture slowly, a fraction at a time, waiting between changes, watching how the engine responded. He let it warm properly before touching anything, resisting the urge to intervene too soon. When it stalled, he didn't curse anymore. He simply reset and tried again. There was a rhythm to it now, a dialogue carried out in sound and vibration. One afternoon, after hours of careful work, the engine settled into a steadier idle than he had ever heard from it before. It was not smooth by modern standards, but it was consistent. It held itself together without his hand hovering over the controls, ready to shut it down. He stepped back, heart beating faster, afraid that even his presence might disrupt it. He shut it off himself this time, not because it failed, but because he decided it had done enough for the day. That decision felt like a turning point. He was no longer reacting to the machine. He was directing it. With the engine behaving well enough to trust for short periods, he turned his attention to everything else that might betray him the moment the car tried to move. The braking system worried him most. Rust had eaten away at parts that were never meant to be neglected for decades. He disassembled what he could, cleaned and adjusted, replaced what was beyond saving with salvaged pieces that fit well enough after careful modification. He tested the response by hand again and again, refusing to accept anything less than predictable resistance. The transmission came next. He worked through each gear slowly, turning the mechanisms manually, listening for grinding or hesitation. He made small adjustments, tightening and loosening until the motion felt honest. The clutch resisted at first, stiff and uncooperative, but gradually it began to respond. Nothing was perfect, but nothing felt dangerous. When he finally decided to try moving the car under its own power, he did so without ceremony. He opened the barn doors wider than before, letting pale winter light flood in. Cold air rushed inside, sharp and clean. The car looked different in that light, less like a relic and more like a machine that still belonged in the world. He climbed into the seat carefully. The leather complained beneath him, dry and cracked, but it held. He placed his hands on the steering wheel and paused, letting the moment settle. Then he started the engine. It came alive without protest, rough but willing. He eased the car forward slowly. At first there was only a slight movement, barely noticeable. Then the unmistakable roll of wheels over uneven ground. The car lurched, hesitated, then moved again. He kept his foot light, his senses alert. The sound of the engine echoed off the barn walls as the car crossed the threshold into open air. It stalled after only a few yards. He laughed then, a short, surprise sound that fogged the air in front of him. The failure did not feel like defeat. It felt like proof. The car had moved. It had carried itself, however, briefly. That was something no one could laugh away. He pushed it back inside with effort and tried again after making minor adjustments. The second attempt went farther. The third made it around part of the yard before stalling. Each time he learned more. Each time the car revealed another weakness, another place where it demanded attention. By the end of the day, his body ached, but his mind felt lighter than it had in months. He stood outside the barn as the sun dipped low, watching the car rest where he had left it, its engine ticking softly as it cooled. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that it might be capable of more than he had planned. The reactions from others changed as well. Word spread quickly, faster than he expected. People drove by more slowly now. A few stopped outright. They did not laugh as openly. Some asked questions, careful ones, as if unsure how serious he was. One man offered to buy the car for a sum that would have been insulting weeks earlier, but now carried a hint of uncertainty. He refused without explanation. That evening he prepared the car not for display but for readiness. He checked the fuel again, storing a small reserve where it would not freeze. He gathered tools and placed them where they could be reached quickly. He added an old blanket to the car, more for comfort than necessity. He tested the lights, dim but functional, and made mental notes about what still needed improvement. Outside, the sky darkened early. The weather had been unsettled for days, the kind of quiet that often preceded trouble. The radio spoke of incoming storms, of heavy snow and high winds. He listened without much reaction, but something in the air made him pause. Before closing the barn for the night, he stood beside the car one last time. He rested a hand on the cold metal of the hood and felt an unfamiliar sense of gratitude. The machine had not betrayed him. It had simply asked him to meet it where it was. As he shut the doors and walked away, the wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of harder days ahead. He did not know yet how soon he would need the car or how much he would ask of it. He only knew that when the time came, he wanted it as ready as he could make it. The wind arrived before the snow. It moved through the county in low, restless gusts that rattled loose boards and made the bare trees groan. By late afternoon, the sky had taken on that particular color that never meant anything good, a flat, heavy gray that pressed down on the land and drained it of depth. The radio crackled with warnings, vague at first, then increasingly urgent. Snowfall expected overnight, high winds, possible power outages, travel strongly discouraged. He listened with half an ear as he worked, tightening one last fitting beneath the hood, wiping his hands on a rag stiff with old grease. The car stood where he had left it, facing the open doors of the barn as if ready to leave. He noticed that detail only later, when the storm had already begun to make itself known. By evening, the temperature dropped fast. The wind sharpened, cutting through clothing and finding every weakness in walls and windows. He closed the barn doors earlier than usual and walked back to the house under a sky that seemed to be sinking closer to the ground. Snowflakes began to fall, sparse at first, then thicker, swirling sideways as the wind took control of them. The power went out just after dark. It was not dramatic. There was no explosion of sound or flash of light, just a quiet click and a sudden absence. The hum of appliances died. The lamps went dark. The house felt instantly colder, larger, emptier. He stood still for a moment, listening, then moved on instinct. Candles came out. The old flashlight from the kitchen drawer still worked. He layered on another sweater and checked the small heater he kept for emergencies, knowing it would only help for so long. Outside, the storm grew louder. Snow began to pile against the walls, filling the yard, erasing the familiar lines of the road. The wind howled across the fields, relentless and impatient. By the time he settled into a chair near the window, visibility was already dropping. The world beyond the glass was becoming something else entirely. His phone buzzed on the table, startling him. The signal was weak, flickering in and out, but a message came through. It was from a neighbor 2 miles down the road, a man he had known for years but rarely spoken to beyond brief greetings. The message was short and frantic. His brother had collapsed. Chest pain, trouble breathing. They had tried calling for help, but the lines were overwhelmed and the ambulance couldn't get through. Roads were already closing. They didn't know what to do. He read the message twice, then a third time, feeling the weight of it settle in his chest. He tried calling back, but the signal dropped. He stood and paced the room, the storm pounding at the house as if urging him to move faster. His mind ran through options, discarding each one as quickly as it appeared. Waiting was not an option. Walking would take too long and might not be possible at all. Calling others would only lead to the same dead ends. He thought of the barn. The image came unbidden, sharp and immediate. The car, old and imperfect, waiting in the cold. He had prepared it for just in case, not knowing what that case would be. Now the answer stood in front of him, unignorable. He pulled on his coat, boots, and gloves, moving with a clarity that surprised him. Fear was there, but it did not slow him. It focused him. Outside, the wind nearly knocked him sideways as he crossed the yard. Snow stung his face, finding its way into his collar. By the time he reached the barn, his breath came in short, hard bursts. He forced the doors open against the wind and stepped inside, closing them behind him with effort. The barn was colder than the house, the air biting and raw. He switched on the lantern and hung it where it would cast as much light as possible. The car waited in that circle of yellow, unchanged and yet suddenly different. He worked quickly but carefully. He checked the fuel, thick but usable. He ran his hands along the lines, feeling for anything brittle or loose. He gathered the tools he had prepared days earlier and placed them within reach. He spread the blanket over the seat, more for warmth than comfort. Every motion felt deliberate, stripped of doubt. Starting the engine took longer than it had before. The cold fought him, stiffening everything, slowing the response. The engine turned reluctantly, coughing, then falling silent. He paused, breathed into his hands, tried again. On the third attempt, it caught, sputtered, then settled into a rough but steady rhythm. The sound filled the barn, loud and reassuring. He waited only as long as he dared, letting the engine warm just enough to respond. Time felt compressed, each second heavy with consequence. When he eased the car forward and opened the doors, the storm rushed in to meet him, a wall of white and noise. He drove out into it without looking back. The road was already disappearing. Snow covered the gravel, smoothing it into something treacherous and unfamiliar. He followed memory more than sight, guiding the car along paths he had walked and driven 100 times before. The headlights cut weak tunnels through the snow, barely enough to see the next few yards. The wind shoved at the car, testing its resolve. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, listening to the engine, feeling every vibration through the frame. The car moved slower than he wanted, but it moved. Modern vehicles lay abandoned along the road, half buried already, their dark shapes swallowed by snow. He passed them carefully, aware of how easily he could join them if he misjudged even slightly. The storm pressed in from all sides, erasing landmarks, blurring the world into a featureless expanse. More than once he stopped, got out into the wind, and checked his position, orienting himself by feel and instinct. Each time the cold bit harder, stealing warmth and strength, urging him to hurry. When he finally reached the neighbor's house, it was nearly invisible beneath the snow. Lights glowed dimly through a window, flickering with the uncertain power of candles. People rushed out as he pulled up, faces pale and tense. They did not ask questions. They helped him carry the man out, wrapped in blankets, breathing shallowly, eyes unfocused. He drove back into the storm with the weight of another life behind him. The car struggled more now, the added load testing its limits. The engine faltered once, then recovered. He whispered encouragement without realizing he was doing it. The journey to the doctor's house felt longer than the one before, the road steeper, the wind angrier. When the car finally rolled to a stop and hands reached out to take the man inside, His legs nearly gave way beneath him. He leaned against the hood, chest heaving, snow melting into his coat. The car shuddered once more, then went quiet. He stood there in the storm, lantern light spilling from the doorway ahead, knowing only that something fragile and irreplaceable had been carried through the night. The engine had done its part. Whatever came next would come after the storm. The storm did not ease after he delivered the man to the doctor. If anything, it grew more determined, as though offended by the fact that anyone had managed to move through it at all. Snow drove sideways now, thick and blinding, erasing the tracks he had just made almost as soon as the car rolled past. The wind slammed into the sides of the vehicle, rattling every loose panel and seam, testing the integrity of metal that had already endured more than its share of years. He did not allow himself the relief he wanted to feel. There was no room for it yet. The car had gone quiet in front of the doctor's house, the engine's final shudder echoing ominously in the cold night. He knew better than to assume it would start again without resistance. The machine had given everything it had to get this far, and Winter was not done demanding payment. Inside the house, the doctor worked quickly, efficient and calm despite the circumstances. The man he had brought in was alive, responsive enough to give faint signs of awareness. That was enough to anchor him. He listened to the instructions given, nodded when thanked, and excused himself before anyone could insist he stay. His mind was already back outside with the car. The wind nearly knocked him over when he stepped back into the storm. Snow had piled higher around the wheels and ice crusted along the edges of the hood. He brushed at it with numb hands, clearing what he could, knowing it would never be enough. The lantern he carried cast a weak halo in the swirling white, barely illuminating the ground beneath his boots. Starting the engine again was harder than before. The cold had seeped deeper, stiffening everything. The fuel was sluggish, reluctant to move. He tried once. The engine turned slowly, unwillingly, then stopped. He tried again, breathing steadily, refusing to let panic creep in. On the third attempt, it coughed, sputtered, then fell silent once more. He rested his forehead against the steering wheel for a moment, eyes closed, listening to the wind. This was the point he had known might come, the place where preparation met reality and reality asked for more. He pulled himself back together, climbed out, and lifted the hood, the metal biting through his gloves. Snow fell into the engine compartment as he worked, melting instantly against the warmer surfaces, then refreezing as slick ice. He checked the fuel line first, feeling along its length until his fingers found the problem. A small crack had widened under the strain of cold and vibration, seeping fuel just enough to starve the engine. It was the kind of failure he had anticipated, but knowing that did not make fixing it any easier. He worked by touch more than sight, the lantern swinging uselessly in the wind. He wrapped the damaged section as tightly as he could, reinforcing it with wire and cloth, fingers clumsy and slow. The cold gnawed at him, creeping into his joints, dulling sensation. Time stretched thin. Every second spent exposed felt like a risk he could not afford. When he finally climbed back into the car, his hands shook as he tried the ignition again. The engine hesitated, then caught weakly. He coaxed it, holding steady, listening for signs of protest. It was not happy, but it was alive. That was enough. The road back was worse than before. The storm had erased what little clarity the landscape once had. Fences disappeared beneath drifts. Trees became vague shadows, looming suddenly out of the whiteness. He drove slowly, deliberately, keeping the engine in a range where it seemed least likely to fail. The headlights were nearly useless now, reduced to a faint glow swallowed almost immediately by the snow. More than once the car faltered, power dropping without warning. Each time his chest tightened as he eased off, adjusted, waited for the engine to respond. Once, it nearly died completely, the sound thinning to a whisper. He pressed his gloved hand against the dashboard as if that might somehow transfer warmth or will, and waited. The engine recovered, uneven but determined. The cold inside the car was brutal. The heater, such as it was, offered nothing. Ice crept along the inside of the windshield, forcing him to wipe it clear again and again. His breath fogged the air, freezing at the edges of the glass. He could feel exhaustion setting in, heavy and dangerous. He fought it by focusing on the smallest details, the feel of the steering wheel, the pitch of the engine, the faint outline of the road ahead. At one point, he was forced to stop entirely. A drift had formed across the road, taller than the hood. He climbed out again, sinking nearly to his knees in snow, and assessed the situation. Going around was not an option. Turning back was worse. He cleared what he could with his hands, then returned to the car, heart pounding. The engine strained as he pushed forward, tires spinning, snow spraying uselessly behind him. For a moment it seemed the car would bog down completely. He eased off, then tried again, rocking it gently, refusing to force what could not be forced. Slowly, inch by inch, the car moved forward, crested the drift, and slid down the other side. He laughed then, a harsh sound torn from his chest, lost almost immediately to the wind. The laugh was not joy so much as release, the body's response to surviving something that might easily have gone the other way. By the time the lights of his own house came into view, faint and flickering through the storm, his strength was nearly gone. He guided the car into the yard and brought it to a stop with care, unwilling to ask anything more of it than necessary. The engine sputtered once, twice, then fell silent for good. He sat there for a long moment, hands resting on the wheel, head bowed. The storm howled around him, indifferent to what had just occurred. Inside the house there would be cold and darkness, but also shelter. Inside the barn the car would rest, battered but intact. He stepped out into the snow, closed the door gently, and stood there, breathing hard, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle fully at last. He had done what he set out to do. The rest would have to wait until morning. Morning came slowly, as if the world itself needed time to recover from the night. The wind had quieted some time before dawn, leaving behind a heavy, muffled silence that pressed against the walls of the house. Snow lay everywhere, smooth and unbroken, transforming the familiar landscape into something distant and unreal. When he finally woke, his body protested the movement, every muscle stiff, every joint aching with the deep fatigue that followed effort, pushed beyond comfort. The house was cold, but not as cold as it had been during the night. Sometime while he slept, the power had returned. The lights glowed softly, almost tentatively, as if unsure they were welcome back. He stood in the kitchen for a long moment, hands wrapped around a mug of hot coffee, letting the warmth seep into him. Only then did he allow himself to think clearly about what had happened. The first thing he did was look out the window toward the barn. The car sat where he had left it, half buried in snow, dark and motionless. For a brief, irrational moment, fear tightened in his chest. He set the mug down and pulled on his coat, stepping outside into the crisp morning air. The cold was sharp but no longer vicious. The storm had spent itself. Walking to the barn felt different now. Each step carried the memory of the night before. The wind, the darkness, the way the engine had strained and held on. He brushed snow from the barn doors and opened them carefully. Inside, the air was still and quiet. The lantern hung where he had left it, untouched. The car rested beneath a thin layer of frost, its shape familiar and somehow dignified. He ran a hand along the hood, the metal cold but solid. The machine had given everything it had when it mattered. Whatever damage had been done would have to be addressed later. For now, it was enough that it had survived. By mid-morning, the road began to show signs of life again. Snowplows moved slowly in the distance. Neighbors emerged from their houses, checking fences, clearing paths, assessing what the storm had taken and what it had spared. It did not take long for word to spread. People began to come by, not in groups at first, but one by one. Some brought food, others simply came to look. They asked careful questions, their voices quieter than before. They wanted to know if it was true, if he had really driven through the storm when no one else could. He answered plainly, without embellishment. He had never been interested in turning effort into legend. Someone told him the man he had brought to the doctor was stable. Another said he was improving, that the doctor believed the timing had made all the difference. The words settled over him slowly, carrying a weight heavier than any praise. He nodded and thanked them, unsure what else to say. Later that afternoon, one of the men who had laughed the loudest during the early days stood awkwardly at the edge of the yard. He did not joke now. He spoke briefly, offering help with repairs, spare parts, anything that might be useful. There was no apology in his words, but there was something close enough to matter. The offer was sincere. Others followed. Tools appeared. Hands offered themselves without being asked. The barn, once a place of solitary effort, filled with quiet activity. No one made speeches. No one needed to. The car stood at the center of it all, not as a curiosity, but as a reminder of what had been accomplished. As the day wore on, he found himself moving differently among the people. Nothing about him had changed. Not his work, not his habits, not his circumstances. And yet something invisible had shifted. The looks he received were steadier now, more respectful. He had not demanded that change. It had arrived on its own. That evening, after the others had gone, he returned to the barn alone. He closed the doors behind him and stood in the quiet, listening to the faint sounds of settling snow outside. The car waited patiently, just as it always had. He knew there would be repairs ahead, more long hours, more cold days. The work was not finished. Perhaps it never would be. But as he set his tools down and began planning the next steps, he understood something clearly for the first time. The $10 he had spent on the barn had never been the real cost. The cost had been time, effort, patience, and the willingness to be laughed at without turning away. What he had gained was not a machine or even respect, but certainty. Old things were not useless simply because they were old. Simple things were not weak because they lacked complexity. And sometimes the value of a decision revealed itself only when the world grew quiet again, after the storm had passed. He switched off the light and stepped out into the evening, closing the barn behind him with care. Inside, the car rested, no longer forgotten. Outside, the world moved forward, changed in small but meaningful ways. If this story moved you, subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Watch the next video on the channel, and don't forget to share this one with someone who needs to see it.